According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, 17.2 million children were born in 2017 in China, which is 630,000 less than the previous year. China's total fertility rate, an estimated 1.6 children per woman in 2017, is below the rate needed to keep the population steady. The number of working population between the ages of 15 and 59 has dropped by almost 40 million in the last 5 years. In November 2015, President Xi Jinping alluded to an absolute reduction of work-age population in China. So how did that come about? What are the challenges therein, and what is being done to cope with that trend if it is not stoppable? And what experiences and lessons could be shared between China and other developing countries in addressing population challenges? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. We are honored to be joined in the studio by Professor Babatunde Ahonsi, the United Nations Population Fund or UNFPA representative in China. The agency is the UN Reproductive Health and Rights Agency, which focuses on ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights to improve the lives of women, adolescents and youth. And I'm also very pleased to be joined by Professor Baochang, who specializes in demography at the Center for Population and Development Studies at Renmin University of China. He is also the Vice President of the Asian Population Association. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio, Professor Gu and Dr. Ahonsi. I think before we start the discussion, let's give the audience a rough idea of the population of China. We all know the most populous country, the official number for 2017 is 1.39 billion. And the life expectancy on average is 76.3 years. Among the Chinese population, there are more male than female. For instance, the female population is 680 million and the male population is 710 million. But the people aged over 60 accounted for 240 million. That is 17% of the Chinese population for last year. So what are we talking about putting these numbers together? What kind of a demographic picture are we looking at, Professor Gu?
First, we have to understand, overall speaking, China's population situation has been changed historically from what we used to imagine about China. You know, in terms of the number of children per family, in terms of the number of the older people in the overall population, and also the changing in the labor force. When we have the long time low fertility, that means more and more these younger people get into the population, get into the labor force, and the proportionally speaking, the young labor becomes smaller in the overall population. The labor force will become older than too.
You said we have to take a historical perspective to this. I think it is important to explain to our audience, right? In the beginning, in the before the end of 1970s, China pretty much encouraged women to have as many children as possible. And then we had a drastic shift in our policy where every couple is encouraged or allowed, basically, was to have only one child. And then since the beginning of 2016, China started this one couple, two children policy. What has that done to the population of China?
When we look back in the 1960s or 70s, at that time, the average Chinese family will have 5 or 6 children, about that level. But the population grew very rapid, you know, about the 2% annually, which means that every 30 to 40 years the population will double if that continues. So that time China really faced a very big challenge, how to slow down the population growth.
How to feed all these people.
Yeah, slow down population growth. So slow down population growth, we cannot increase the mortality. The only way we can do is to reduce birth rate. So reduce the number of children per family or per woman. That time family planning become a tool, means used to achieve the population goal. That's why the policy developed and even tightened to the one child per couple or per family from what used to be in the 1970s. We call the longer, fewer, later policy. But overall, in the last several decades, because of, on the one hand, the tremendous socio-economic development occurred in China. Meanwhile, we have very strong family planning programs as well. Altogether, make the fertility reduce very rapidly. The rapidity of fertility reduction is good in terms of the reduce the burden of the population and more focused on socio-economic development. But meanwhile, it brings into new issues, which means more rapid aging, more people in the old ages, and also less children born. And because of less children born means that later on in the future we will have less labor force when they grow up.
Right. Professor Ahonsi, when we talk about the so-called demographic dividend, which has been a term that a lot of people use, and saying China's economic miracle partly came from that kind of a dividend that we were able to harvest. So where are we at this moment? Can we still enjoy this demographic dividend, or because of the reduction of population here, we're facing a very different picture?
I think there are two dividends that are reapable, that can be harvested. The first one is the first demographic dividend, which happens when the proportion in the working population grows and the proportion of children in the population declines, and you have intensive, sustained investment in health and education, skills building. That, of course, has contributed to China's rapid economic and social transformation. And depending on the analysis, some say between a third and a quarter of the unprecedented economic growth that China enjoyed in the 80s and 90s into the first decade of this century could be attributed to demographic dividend. Of course, as Professor Gu made clear, because of the sustained below replacement level fertility situation China has been in, we now have a rapidly aging population.
Right.
But from the point of view of the United Nations Population Fund, aging presents challenges but also opportunities, both on the demand and supply side. And because the government of China has prioritized addressing aging from multiple dimensions, I think there is also a strong possibility that aging could be leveraged as an asset for the continued sustainable development of China, provided we take a long-term view of this process and we approach it from a life cycle perspective. So let me give you two examples of the point I'm trying to make, illustrations of the point I'm trying to make. The nature of work is changing.
Right.
That's the first thing. Work is becoming more digitized and virtualized. Okay, the 70-year-old today in China is a lot healthier, more skilled, and more tech-savvy than the 70-year-old in China 20, 30 years ago. So it need not mean, therefore, that simply because you are above 60, you are no longer able to contribute to the economic development of the country. So that's one point. So to the extent that we can continue to keep our elderly healthy, skilled, and engaged in productive activities, then aging need not be as difficult for China as it appears to be now. Secondly, if we continue to invest in our young ones and give them all the necessary skills to adapt to the needs of the rapidly modernizing economy of China, then their productivity will increase, they will earn more income, the tax base will be larger to support the larger population of the elderly. At the same time that more and more old people are staying longer in the labor force and contributing. So there are two ways, essentially, you deal with the fear or the challenge of a heavy burden of the aged, a large population of the aged. One is to increase your tax base by increasing tax on the working population, Okay?
Tax.
Yes.
US
So that you can fund pension, you can fund health care, you can fund social protection.
But to transition from the first dividend, from the ability to harvest the first dividend to the second, I think there is a period of time needed, right? You need to invest in all of that. And where is China there in terms of the ability to harvest the second type of dividend that Dr. Ahonsi alluded to?
I think he said it's very right. You know, aging, on the one hand, present as a challenge, but also can be an opportunity as well, if we can deal with it properly. But there are two issues. One is the social security issue. The majority of Chinese people still living in the rural area, which are not covered by the adequately, at least by the social security system in China so far. But of course, government now is working on to create a universal coverage, but it takes a while. You know, it's not easy. If we look at the experience of those developed countries in terms of the setting up of the social security. Second is as the Babatunde said very right. You know, the older people now become healthier, live longer. But they cannot work longer. Why? Retirement age is still fixed. You know? So it's necessary for the whole population to understand why we need to change the retirement age.
And people don't want to work longer.
That's right. But if you now in school longer, that means you start to work later. Then your life expectancy become longer. Then your retire age still fixed. The proportionally in your whole life, the time working becomes smaller and smaller, which means that society cannot be sustainable.
What is the Chinese government policy or tendency there in terms of retirement age? Is the discussion going on to extend it?
It's always a debate over years, but you know, there's two concerns. On the one concern, as we said, you know, we want to have a strong tax base, which means more people in the working group. But on the other hand, you know, afraid that the unemployment rate may go up if you keep these older people in the labor force. So it's a kind of dilemma going on.
Right. Well, I think it is worth mentioning what President Xi Jinping said in November 2015 when he was explaining the 5-year plan, the 13th 5-year plan, and about this two-child policy that China was pushing forward. Just basically a month later, he was talking about an absolute reduction of the work age population, and that this trend is continuing. So what does that mean then? Does that mean that this is going to be the reality in the future? Can this be mediated, or can this be stopped, or people will just have to cope with that from now on?
No, but that's the point I was making, that it can be mediated, and beyond mediation, it can be leveraged to actually increase the productive capacity of the economy and also to increase the tax base.
That's right.
But there have to be certain policy and possibly legal reforms as well to make it possible for people to stay longer in the workforce, one. Two, there are certain population groups now that are not fully participating in the labor force, to find ways to get them to also participate in the labor force. And secondly, to adapt the system to the changing nature of work. Work does not have to be 9 to 5. You come into an office. I mean, the future of work has changed, and it's already here with us. And I think a country as dynamic and as modernizing as China will take advantage of these changes. So the real issue is, can the necessary policy changes and legal reforms be made fast enough to adapt to these changes that could transform aging into an opportunity rather than a challenge?
Well, as I said, since the beginning of 2016, China initiated this two-child policy, right? And a lot of people actually went on to have their second baby after a gap of many years. Is that addressing this problem adequately, Professor Gu?
You know, so far we see that not as many babies born as expected.
Why not?
You know, another young women may change their mind, as the prophecy also said that the desire for childbearing becomes very weakened among the young people born in the 1980s and 90s. You know, these are a lot of socio-economic factors affect their childbearing. You know, the society becomes more competitive. You know, and the
cost going up.
Young people become more career-oriented rather than, you know, home-centered. You know, so a lot of the social changes going on. But as the member brought up another important issue, so we may need to create a more flexible working system rather than so fixed, 5 to 9. And particularly with the technical development in China, it's possible to do that. So this aspect we need more develop to get to the potential.
Okay, we are going to take a very short break, and you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. When we come back, we'll talk about what experiences and lessons from China's population management work that can be shared with other developing countries, and what kind of South cooperation has been undergoing between China and the rest of the developing world. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Point, and the guests in my studio have been Dr. Babatunde Ahonsi from the UN Population Fund and Professor Baochang from the Center for Population and Development Studies at Renmin University. So we were talking about China, and Dr. Ahonsi, you come from Nigeria, which is now the 7th most populous country in the world, and it is projected that by 2050 Nigeria will become the 3rd most populous country in the world after India and China. However, the rate of unemployment is also reaching new high most recently. So what kind of situation is Nigeria looking at in terms of demographic dividend and population growth?
I think Nigeria is at a crossroad in terms of being at the point of entering what we call the window of opportunity for reaping the demographic dividend. Because the truth is that in spite of the rapid rate of population growth, which is driven by what we call the inbuilt momentum, the truth of the matter is that the working age population in Nigeria has been increasing, and the population of under 15s of children has been declining. And once you have that, you then need to learn the lessons from countries like China by investing heavily in the health, education, skills building, creating an economic system that generates jobs for this growing working age population as the population of children has started coming down. So if Nigeria is able to make the necessary kinds of investment, which I do believe the current government is very sensitive to and is beginning to act on, then we might be able to reap some of the demographic dividend, the first demographic dividend, but it is not automatic. Those policies have to be implemented on a sustained basis. And this large working age population that is followed by a smaller cohort population, it will be in a situation, because it has skills, it has jobs, it will be in a situation to drive the rapid economic growth of Nigeria. If those investments are not made, however, then the huge youth bulge and the large population that we'll have will become a major challenge.
So is that situation unique to Nigeria or pretty much representative of what is happening in Africa?
Across Africa, for much of Africa. And unfortunately, even for the few countries in Africa that have completed the demographic transition, like the countries in North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, South Africa, Mauritius, and there are many countries now going into the phase of rapid fertility decline, like Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia. The fear we have is that they may not be able to reap the first demographic dividend to the extent to which China, South Korea, Japan have done, because the investments they should have made 10, 15 years ago in health, education, skills building, creating lots of decent jobs have not been made. And when you look at Tunisia, when you look at South Africa, they have gone through that phase without reaping huge demographic dividend. Instead, they've ended up with high levels of youth unemployment, social instability. These are the things that countries like Nigeria need to learn how to avoid by drawing lessons from countries like China, Japan, and South Korea.
Professor Gu, however, what China has done in terms of the ability, the potential to reap the first demographic dividend, do you think that can be somehow be useful to African countries at this stage?
I would definitely say so. I think that today we present a very good combination. In China is the largest population country in Asia, and Nigeria is the largest population country in Africa. In terms of source cooperation, I think it will be very perfectly paired if we can do so, to learn from each other. China has a lot of experience over years in terms of how to reap the demographic dividends, but meanwhile, China has also some lessons.
Right. For instance, what are the lessons to avoid then specifically?
So that we can share with our colleagues in Nigeria and in Africa. So make their transition even much better than China had.
But what kind of lessons, for instance?
What lessons? I'm going. Simply say, I said, fertility decline is necessary. In terms of the development of a country, that when you had fertility very high in terms of the number of children per family, or in terms of the speed of population growth, which is not good either for the society or for family. But meanwhile, we see what the lessons. If fertility decline too rapid, to a too low level, it will create some new issues we've never thought about. For example, the aging issue. Aging is inevitable worldwide trend, but aging come to China become too quick, too sudden. The society, the government, the family are not prepared. Suddenly become a very old society. And also, on the other hand, is the labor force issue. Also, as you probably said a bit about the sex ratio issue, because of fertility decline too rapid, people become so squeezed between the number they want and the sex of children they prefer. So sex ratio at birth become an issue for so long in China. And we really want the African country to avoid that occur when they experience fertility decline.
What kind of cooperation or what kind of efforts are going on to link China with other developing countries, for instance in Africa, so that these kind of issues can be talked about and expertise can be shared?
I mean, there are several. One is obviously around population management, using population data to guide your policy making and your management of economic, social, and other programs and interventions. Because at the end of the day, what does population mean? Population means people, whether it's in terms of their number, where they are. And unless you have the system to determine their number, how they are distributed, their age, how they will grow in size, and so on, you cannot possibly implement effective development policies. So that's one lesson that countries in Africa are learning from China, and China is sharing with Africa through various exchange programs, capacity building and training opportunities being provided by the government of China through Chinese institutions to officials, professionals, and students from Africa. There's also a lot of cooperation around healthcare delivery. Remember, one of the main vehicles by which you can achieve sustained fertility decline, which is a precondition for reaping the first dividend, is to bring down child mortality and maternal mortality.
Which China has done very well.
And China has a lot of expertise, and China has many years of providing healthcare related assistance to Africa through medical missions, through donation of equipment, through intervening in health emergencies, and more recently through very structured capacity building, skills transfer programs. So I see a lot of opportunities there, and I think it will grow with China's South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund. China now has an international development cooperation agency, so it's becoming a lot more structured. But there are many lessons to be learned from China. The the positive thing about the current situation is that the leadership of China is willing to share the lessons from its own development experience, both the positive and the not so positive. And that can only be a good thing for the future of global development.
Well, when people talk about China's cooperation or collaboration with the other developing countries to address development issues, is that China has a lot of experiences to share or lessons to share. But I think it always comes both ways, right? And I believe there must be something or many things that China can also learn from our African, for instance, African counterparts. Professor Gu, very briefly, I don't have much time left. What can China learn from its African counterpart in terms of population management or governance? Have we learned something? Is there anything that...
You know, in fact, although we have a lot now, the frequent cooperation between China and African countries, but, you know, relatively speaking, not that much in the field of population and family planning so far.
You would like to see more?
Yeah, sure. As I had the chance to visit the African country when I was at Addis Ababa to attend the conference, I think one thing we can share with the African people is that, for so many years, Chinese government showed a very strong commitment on population issues. And we set up a very good network to provide the family planning service, even in these remote and rural areas with very poor socioeconomic conditions. I visited the villages in Africa. I think the people don't want to have so many children. For example, Nigeria, according to data, now still 5 to 6 children per family. How to help the African women to avoid what the number of children they want to avoid. That's something we can share with our colleagues in Nigeria as well.
Okay, but Dr. Ahonsi, coming back to my question, what can China learn from African countries in terms of
at least two things. China is, as we know, becoming a bigger player in international development and global governance. And one of the things that President Xi Jinping has said, and through the ministers, is that China does not want to repeat the mistakes of the old established donor countries, which is why China is emphasizing South-to-South cooperation. And one of the ways not to repeat the mistakes of the old established donor countries is to come to Africa to see where so many of those mistakes were made, and to learn, listening to Africans, about how not to repeat those mistakes. So I think that is an important contribution African countries can make to China, especially in terms of its growing global role, how to avoid the mistakes of the oldest established donor countries. The second thing is in terms of the centrality of primary health care in sustaining health improvement. I think China has done a lot with specialized health care, and China has certainly achieved a lot. And part of China's success in transforming the health of its citizens was through primary health care. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, primary health care has basically gone backwards in China. Fortunately, the Healthy China 2030 strategy seeks to reverse that and to give a more prominence and greater boost to primary health care. And I think there are many good examples of working primary health care systems in Africa that China can learn from.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Dr. Babatunde Ahonsi, the United Nations Population Fund or UNFPA representative in China, and Professor Gu Baochang from the Center for Population and Development Studies at Renmin University in Beijing. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.